Okay, good afternoon. Welcome to our session on simulations. My name is Ryan Kelsey. I'm one of the associate directors of the center, and along with Rob Garfield and Gordon McCord, we'd like to welcome you here this afternoon. Simulations are an educational approach that our center has been working on for many years, since its inception. At previous conferences, we've highlighted several projects. Rob, if you go ahead and just hit the first slide, you'll see some projects. If you've been to some of our events in the past, you'll probably recognize. I think we overshot a bit there. There they are. A few of the examples. Brownfield Action is a very common project that we've talked about a number of times here at the center. It's an environmental simulation used at Barnard College for a number of years. It's funded by the National Science Foundation. It puts students in the role of environmental investigators, as one example. Relief Sim is something used at the public health school uptown. That's where students are put in the role of a humanitarian crisis manager. They have to work through a crisis where they have to prioritize their resources for identifying potential outbreaks, water scarcity, sanitation facilities, you name it, working through that. And then the heart simulator, which was also shown at this event in the past, that's used with medical students for examining the algorithms that govern how the human heart functions. So if you want to know any more about those projects, you're welcome to talk with us afterwards, and we'd be happy to show them to you. But today we're going to focus on the fourth example that's up there, the Millennium Village simulation. Before I do that, for folks who maybe aren't familiar with simulations, I'm just going to take a minute or two to talk about what they are, why we think they're a good idea in certain situations, and what some of their challenges are. And so I think one thing to think through is, well, why would you consider using a sim? Well, in our language at the center, we like to think of simulations as made up of three parts. A model, some kind of set of algorithms, that can be adjusted with parameter changes by the person using the model, some kind of role for a student to play, and then some kind of goal or task to act on the model. So using some of those previous examples, in the case of the Relief Sim model, the model is actually a refugee camp. Our staff has put together a model of the people and the infrastructure in the refugee camp, and students have to, in their role as crisis manager, work through the different priorities that they have to choose from, and that affects the model dynamically, and you get different outcomes if you play it multiple times. People are probably maybe more familiar with things like a flight simulator. In that kind of a model, of course, the model itself is the airplane and the rules of flight. Your role would typically be as pilot, and your task could be anything from a proper takeoff to maybe replicating a World War II bombing run or something along those lines. We don't have that project, but if someone's interested, they should talk with us. So why would they be a good idea? Well, we think there are kind of 5 good reasons for considering simulations, and you'll see this pattern reflected in the different course examples where we've used them, including the one that we're going to focus on today with Millennium Village. The first thing is about integrating disparate topics. There are a lot of courses on campus where the topics that are taught can be siloed off. So whether it's a survey class or some kind of introductory course where there's kind of traditional set of lectures that are done sort of chapter sequence-wise, it's often hard for students to come up with a more holistic or kind of way of seeing the interdependencies between these topics. Simulations provide an opportunity to work towards a more integrated understanding of a seemingly disparate curriculum, as we'll see. A second reason for considering simulations is that you want people to learn some kind of model or system through experimentation. And in this one, I think the heart simulator is a good example, because here the students need to understand the fundamental underpinnings of how the heart functions. And rather than seeing that in just sort of narrative form or case form or images in a textbook, they can actually manipulate the different parameters that govern how the heart functions and see what the cause and effect results are, come up with the correlations. And as our faculty talked about at one of our sessions a few years ago, he was just amazed at the different level of questions that he would get from students, just from their example, of playing around with this through trial and error. So that's another reason why we like to think of this technique as a good one. It's also good for practicing difficult, rare, or dangerous tasks. So tasks that aren't easily accessible. In the case of brownfield action, a simulation about environmental contamination, and you can't easily send students out on a field assignment to an area that's been contaminated and have them explore it and try to understand the cause and extent of the problems that have taken place there. But we can simulate that experience for people and give them more access to it. And as we'll see with the Millennium Villages, it's not so easy to send undergraduates to Africa immediately, although we hope they'll get there later in their studies. But we can simulate the experience a bit and try to establish some emotional connection with the environment that's there. A fourth reason is just decision-making and prioritizing, and this overlaps a bit with our case session that we had earlier in the day. Putting students in the role of having to make decisions themselves, a kind of more inquiry or discovery-based approach, really puts control in the hands of students. Is something that we really strongly believe in. It's more active, and it really forces their engagement and gives motivation for wanting to fill in the blanks of information that perhaps could have formally been delivered lecture style, but doesn't necessarily have to be. And then the last is working with ambiguity. I think another common thing that happens in traditional classrooms is there's the educational process is, for lack of a better phrase, sort of spoon-fed to students a little bit, and they kind of can sit back and wait to be told what they're supposed to know. One nice thing about simulations is that they themselves don't actively teach. You have to engage them. You have to act within them and then respond to the things that change within the system. And so you're driving the learning as opposed to somebody driving it for you. And again, we think that's really important. Now, that's the good news. The hard thing about simulations is there are several challenges. So one is any simulation is inherently reductionist. You can't model everything in a system, and as we'll certainly see in the Millennium Village example today, while we are doing economics, we are not modeling culture, for example. So we don't pretend to do that, and in any educational enterprise with a simulation, you're going to have to make choices about what's in the model and what's not, and that's going to take some work to think through, and you shouldn't overpromise what a simulation is going to deliver. You can look at the model and see, well, what factors are making up this system, and those are the ones that should be driving the educational practices that are going on in that classroom. What else is hard? Well, it requires a commitment to discovery-oriented learning and supporting structures to allow that. This is a different way of teaching, and I think we'll hear a little bit from Gordon about what this is like, that you're not standing up at the front telling people what to do. You're reacting, guiding, waiting to kind of see where students take things and trying to respond to them in a way that drives them forward. That takes work to figure out how to do. Several of our projects that have been around for years, Brownfield Action has been around for 9 years, the lab instructors are still working at this kind of a process of giving up control in the classroom, and it's a difficult thing. What else? Well, it requires extensive testing to ensure a quality experience for students. It's a little bit linked up with the fourth one, which is, it's more work up front. I think if you look, the question always comes up when we show the simulation projects. Wow, it looked like so much effort. How did you pull this off? Like, what is the effort involved? And so just to knock that out right from the start, these are more effort than your typical project. And you've got to spend the effort up front to model them, test them, try them out, and before you get to see the benefits, before you can even put it into play. They're hard to prototype, and it takes a little extra investment up front. And then just lastly, it's difficult to evaluate what the students are learning with a simulation. I mentioned as one of the advantages that it provides us a more holistic, integrated kind of experience where the lessons learned might be a little more tacit. It might not be so easily kind of pulled back apart again to identify what students have known. So, we've worked hard on the different methods, but it's still a challenge to figure out what exactly does a student learn in a particular situation. That's my little simulation intro. So now just a couple words about this particular example that we're going to focus on today. With using this pattern now, you've kind of got the idea of, well, what are we looking for when we're going to do a simulation? We had Jeff Sachs and Gordon McCord and people from the Earth Institute come to us and say, well, we've got this introductory course. It's got undergraduates from all different disciplines and interests. It's a large class. It's got little smaller sections of students that are going to be working separate from the large lectures. It's multidisciplinary, so there are different topics taught week by week that span everything from economics to climate to agriculture. Gordon can give you a lot more detail than I can off the top of my head. And what are the students having a problem doing? Well, I can almost quote it verbatim. They're having a problem linking up the different topics. They're having a hard time integrating the different pieces into some kind of greater whole. There are problem sets, of course, where the students are doing the mathematics behind these things, but they're complaining in their course evaluations that there's no easy way to get the big picture. There's no way to also emotionally connect to the environment that they're supposed to be working on. The course is Challenges of Sustainable Development. It focuses a lot on developing countries. As you'll see in the Millennium Village Sim, the location, the setting is going to be in Africa. It's hard for students here at Columbia, many of them in their first year, to relate to that experience. And perhaps a simulation, at least that's what we thought, would be able to address that in some way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to the guys who really did the work, Rob Garfield and Gordon McCord, who will tell you what happened, demonstrate this simulation briefly, and then entertain your questions. Rob.
Thank you very much, Ryan. This is my third talk of the day, so if I collapse up here, don't worry, the other two know exactly what I need to say, so they can fill in, and they'll just cart me out. I want to let the star of the show, Gordon McCord, take care of most of the discussion, the simulation, because I think as a tool developed for a specific educational purpose, he is really in the best position to discuss it as said tool. But the Millennium Village simulation is complex enough that I think I would like to give you guys a little rundown of how it works so that you know what Gordon is talking about when it gets up here. Ryan, can you begin a new game for me? There you go. I'm done. Okay. All kidding aside, Millennium Village simulation is a simulation of a small village in sub-Saharan Africa, hence the name. As a player or user, you are put in the position of a two-person family. When the simulation begins, your family is in a condition of extreme poverty. That is a situation that is described by not having the actual means to pull yourself out of an impoverished state and being in a state of degenerative poverty. Your goal, if you choose to accept it, and if you take Jeff Sachs' Challenges of Sustainable Development class, you are forced to accept it, is to get your two-person family, possibly expand it, but get them through 50 years of survival. And you'll start in a subsistence state. And there are opportunities along the way as you move on in the simulation to improve your lot or to falter as well. There are three basic needs that your family has, and this again speaks to the inability to model everything in a situation. We may had to make certain choices. For subsistence, your needs are raw food, fuel wood to cook said food, and water. And as long as you are getting those things and not getting sick, you will be able to survive. However, that's not such an easy process. Now, in order to get these things, you'll note that Ryan has scrolled down to an area we call Managed Family Effort. Each person in your family has a certain number of hours they can work per day, and you can take those hours and assign them to specific activities. Ryan is now putting 8 hours a day into farming, put about 5 into fuel wood collection, and say 4 into water collection. Let's try fishing. How are we doing here? Just put the rest into agriculture, that's fine. There we go, that's good. Okay, so now he's going to click an end turn button, and when he does this, the time in the simulation is going to be shot forward 6 months in a flash. You didn't even see it happen. And the first thing you'll notice is that you get a report. This report gives you a rundown of the results of all the decisions that you made in the previous turn. And you'll see that you harvested a certain amount of maize and a certain amount of fish, and what that translates into calories per day. You'll also notice on the left in the announcements section that you did meet subsistence, which means you did get enough food and fuel wood, but you didn't meet water subsistence, which is a problem. If we look down at the water area, you'll see we used all the water that we collected. That's because we didn't collect enough. If you scroll down a little bit farther under the fuel wood area, you'll notice that we collected 46.8 metric tons. But we only used 12 of those metric tons in this 6-month period. It's a little hint about where we're going to go with this. So I think we can close out that, Ryan. So what did we do wrong this turn? Anyone? I forgot to tell you, I'm going to call on you. Over there in the corner, they're too much wood, not enough water. That sounds right, doesn't it? So what do you think we should do about that? She's going to go with more time on water collection and less time on wood collection. Let's see what happens. That looks a lot nicer. There's no red in the left-hand column as well. We're still probably spending a little too much time on wood collection. As you can see, we're still getting more than twice as much as we need. We're getting enough water. Some of it we're not using. Sleep? 20, okay. Why don't you close it up? We have 2 people in the family. They're both working 12 hours a day. So we have 24 total hours to allocate. This is the first level, or the sort of a simplified example of the kind of decision making that goes on in playing the Millennium Village simulation. You play for a turn or two, you see the results of the decisions that you made, then you alter those decisions based on what happens. And as time goes on and complexity gets added, your decisions become more difficult to make. And you start understanding the system that goes on behind this a little bit. But what I really want to do now is to pass it off to Gordon McCord, so he can tell us a lot more about why this kind of simulation addresses his particular curricular needs, as well as to tell us some incredible anecdotes about me. Thanks, Gordon.
Afternoon, everybody. Just to let you know who I am, my name's Gordon McCord, and I'm a 4th-year student in the PhD in Sustainable Development, so I'm a doctoral student here. I'm not a Columbia employee. And I've been teaching with Professor Sachs for several years now. And I think the best way for you to see where this comes from is to tell you a little bit about my course in about 2 minutes. And you'll see immediately, I think, how it connects, or how this software connects to the course. The course is about 150 students, and it's titled The Challenge of Sustainable Development. And there are no prerequisites for these undergraduates, so they can come from the English department as well as the math department and everything in between in terms of technical training. And they're going to tackle some of the more interesting challenges that we have as a human race in the 21st century, spanning from how to achieve economic development to how to manage environmental resources, how to think about disease, and all sorts of, from an academic point of view, quite orthogonal lines of study, often unrelated to each other in terms of course of study. So the way we teach it is you've got a few weeks on economic development, and you give them homework on that. You have a few weeks to teach models of disease and the mathematical ways that we think about modeling disease. You test them on that. A few weeks on environmental science, about fisheries, for example, or the growth of forests, or what sustainable harvest rates for renewable resources are, and you test them on that. And that's actually a lot of information for them to chew on at any point in time, because again, there are no prerequisites for the course. So I have to, as a teacher, assume that they know nothing on all of these topics. That's the only way I can teach. Now, the whole premise of teaching sustainable development is to say that the most interesting problems out there, or some of them anyway, of the challenges that we face as a human race this century, are inherently interdisciplinary and exist at those points where our academic disciplines intersect. In the case of African development, yes, there are economics challenges to think about how to generate economic growth, but there's an incredible environmental management questions present in those types of situations. There's also a lot of work in the epidemiology field, those very high disease burden in Africa. And so the whole premise of teaching like this and teaching a survey course is to say these problems are interdisciplinary, and the best way to learn about them is to not just be an economist or just be an epidemiologist, but actually to know a little bit about all these fields. And then they say, okay, well, that's great, and we go through these modules of teaching, and then we finish the course, and they say, I love the course, it was very interesting, you never gave me an interdisciplinary problem to solve. And it's true, I never can give them an interdisciplinary problem to solve. I cannot write down on a piece of paper a math problem that spans economic development with taxation and public goods, with epidemiology and disease models, with the logistic growth curve of a forest or a fishery, with the decision-making and allocation decisions of family. I can't do that, and this is my field. There's no way for me to produce a problem on a piece of paper for a student like that. And they came back to me with that complaint. Well, wait a minute, the whole premise of your course was that the problems are interdisciplinary, but you never pushed me in that direction. So I was very fortunate, and Professor Sachs was very fortunate to be approached by CCN MTL, and they said, well, listen, can we help? And let me tell you, I've had a lot of fun in the last 2 years, because I know nothing about computers. And I've, with them, sat down to produce something that has improved my course by 250%. I haven't changed much of what I teach, but this changes the student's experience dramatically. Because now, when they play as a family in this simulation, they have to decide how to allocate time. Think about the different priorities that they need. How much water do we need? How much fuel wood? So there's a little bit of agronomy in there. More importantly, they need to think about their expenditure priorities with what income they have, right? From the agronomic side, how much fertilizer am I going to need? Do I need to invest in high-yield seed varieties, or are they not necessary at this moment given my caloric needs? Should I instead invest in an anti-malaria bet net because I'm seeing that these numbers of incidents at the village level are getting a little worrisome and there might be an epidemic outbreak soon? Should I fish or farm? Fishing might yield more income in the short run, but if I look at the stock of the fish in the long run, I'm seeing that we might be reaching some critical thresholds for the fishery system, and I might trigger a complete collapse of the local fishery. I might deforest. If I don't move away from fuel wood to propane stoves quickly enough, I might deforest everything in my surrounding area and be unable to sustain myself with fuel wood. All of these problems at the same time, again, I would have never been able to get them to think about it at the same time. Another field, for example, is demography. I give 3, 4, 5 lectures on human fertility behavior. They have to decide whether to have no children, 2 children, 6 children. What's the optimal number of children to have in this context? And it's tremendously fun for them. It's tremendously fun for me. And it's a much, much better learning experience overall. In terms of how I actually use it, well, in section, what you can do with this is have them play out scenarios. Say, start a game and only fish. See what happens after a few years. Start a game and try planting cotton. See what happens after a few years. In the cotton case, they're going to die because there's no road to their village. The transport costs to the local town are so high that they're not going to be able to afford the transport costs at the market price for cotton, and they're not going to be able to afford any food. So you've got to plant maize at the beginning in order to stay alive. And then they're starting to think about infrastructure questions. Okay, well then maybe I should be taxing a little bit the income of the village, and maybe I can start saving up for a road in the future, because there's really a transport cost gain that's going to pervade my whole system. All my costs are going to come down. Fertilizer, high yield seeds, the cost of going to a doctor in the village if my health is getting too low. They're all going to change once you build a road. Again, you're starting to see just in the way I talk how interlinked this whole system is. It's a system, if you're interested, it's a system of about 45 equations that we wrote down that are being continuously calculated by the simulation, and when a student makes a decision, things change throughout the system. I could never do something like that with pen and paper, and that's what makes it so much fun. How much time do we have left? I kind of would rather take questions than keep talking for a
Go ahead.
while.
We can take questions. Yeah, it's fine.
Yes.
Talk a bit about the development process of how you work
With CCN MTL?
how you worked with them and what information exchanged between you two, those 45 formulas and the implementation of that. Thanks.
Yeah, well, it's been about March 2007 is when we sat down the first time. I believe that's correct, yeah. March 2007, and they said, we want to help, and I said, great, because I need help. And they showed me all of the projects that they had done in the past, and we came up with the idea of saying, well, what if we simulated an African village and had students play and built into it several of the themes of the course. Now, the course is not only about this. You're also thinking about the collapse of the northern cod fishery in Canada to model fishery systems. The course is not all about Africa, but what a great example this is to pull it all together, at least to pull all the methods together. And that was the point. So they showed me all of what they're capable of as a group of computer scientists, and I said, well, fantastic, let's do this. We basically met weekly for a year, wrote down a system, and then I kind of stepped back and let them work their magic, and a couple months later, out popped a fantastic piece of software. That's kind of how it happened. And then there's a lot of work just in terms of, if any of you are thinking of doing something like this, there's a lot of work after that, which is, okay, so they pop out the first piece of software with each of these equations just have unknown coefficients throughout. They made it up when they're doing the programming, and they leave a portal for me and my colleagues to go in and change and calibrate this thing. They don't know the prices. What's the right price of cotton? What's the right price for the road? All these things are just unknowns. So there are about, 100 unknowns. And we sit down, and since I've worked in Africa, I know I've calibrated as much as I can to the real world. So here's an administrative view. The student does not see this, but this is the administrator now sitting down and trying to calibrate the system of equations with something that'll work. Now, I can lean on the real world as much as I can. What's the real world? Well, I actually know how much fertilizer costs in a small African village. So that's a starting point for me. So I write down as many things as I can get from the real world, and then I calibrate the unknowns so that the game works, basically. Yes, sir.
Are there any random or part elements that you change in the course of the game? You know, price of cotton goes up, there's a sickness or rainfall, drought, whatever.
Mm-hmm. Well, great question. More than 50% of the equations have a stochastic factor at the end. So there's chaos throughout, which means that you can play the same set of decisions and your game outcome might be completely different.
You can never step into the same river twice.
Yeah. and so literally I just multiply the result, say, of your cotton yield by some 96 to 104% to create some chaos, a random seed generator. And that helps the student. And then there are now some structural changes that happen. I gave the example of you build a road, prices come down. I control that. That's not chaotic. That's actually built in because that comes from the real world.
Do you have to make any changes during the semester?
I can. Well, last year we did not. So last year we calibrated this thing and they play it. This year we have built added capability, and is that I can create canned games now. So they can play the normal game, and then for homework I can give them play this saved game. There will be an epidemic tomorrow. And then they have to try different strategies on how best to mitigate against a public health disaster. That's just an example. Yes?
Yeah, could you speak a little bit about how you evaluated the students on it? And, I guess I'm curious if you evaluated them, how you evaluated them, their reaction to how you chose to evaluate.
Did I evaluate them? Yes. Had to think about how to do it. So I decreased the stress level of this whole exercise by not explicitly grading them, unlike their math problem sets. So basically if they did the assignment with any, and burned more than a brain cell on it, they get a check. And if they really did an outstanding job and came up with some really innovative thoughts, they got a check plus. So for the student point of view, it was fun, relatively stress-free on the grading, and that worked out well. I might change it this year. I haven't decided yet. What did I do last year? I give out an essay question. Write no more than 1 page on this question. Within the simulation, what is the optimal strategy in terms of having children? And explain, when you played, how you came to your decision. They can play 20 different games. By the way, I, as the administrator, can see their 20 different games, what decisions they made. I can graph. Can we pull up a graph? I can graph every student's variable for every game that they ever play. So I can come back to them and I said, if there had been a crash in something, in turn 14, your maize yield crashed. Tell me why. The right answer is that they haven't used fertilizer in 3 years and the soil is depleted of nutrients right now. They're going to experience a crash. They don't know that. They have no way of measuring soil health. But they need to think from their lectures on agronomic science, okay, well, what have I done differently now that could have caused a crash in my maize yield? Oh, I didn't use fertilizer in a while. Why might that be the case? Before I take another question, I'd like to show you something else that we added this year. Could we link to the wiki, please? We've written a whole thematic context now. I spent a few months actually writing it for them. So for any element in the simulation, for example, soil health, they can link out to, go to sim elements, please, and fertilizer, or farming right there. They could go, for example, look at farming, get information on farming in Africa, start linking within these things. There's a link to fertilizer there. It explains what's going into the farming equation. They can link to fertilizer and start getting information from the real world about fertilizer, but also see in this text how it's playing its role in the simulation. So I'm giving them a lot of information here, both in and out of the game. Yes, ma'am.
Actually, that was partly my question. Thank you. When you mentioned fertilizer, and I was thinking health of the family, what about their education towards those ends? How are they educated, let's say, in the real world? Where do those factors come into play, and where does that information about education factor in?
Where does the student actually learn about public health?
Maybe there's a little bit of that in there, but I'm thinking about the family members in that simulated world. How educated can they be? Where does that...
Oh, well, there's a whole education component, right? So you, as the parents, make decisions on how long to send your children to school. You have trade-offs, because your children could actually be farm labor for you. But if you keep them in school longer, then their productivity as adults will be higher. I don't tell
them. They'll know things about fertilizer and...
Right. Well, yeah, I can't model that explicitly, but it comes out in the numbers by, if you start a small business, for example, as an adult, then the more you went to school, the more productive your small business will be. Sir.
Do you find yourself challenging the models you work with because of this calibration process?
Yeah, I find myself pulling my hair out more than challenging the models I work with. But certainly there's, when I'm faced with 100 unknowns, there's a big learning in saying, well, what can I actually just glean from the real world? What's actually not an unknown here? And that was fun, is to go back to the literature and say, actually the effect of fertilizer on a maize is not an unknown. There's a range that comes from experimental work in agronomics that gives me a range of outcomes for a certain amount of fertilizer use. I don't need to have an unknown here. I'll just plop in the mean effect. That was fun for me, for us, to go back to the literature and not totally make up a world, but actually try to lean as much as we could on the real world. Sir.
We know.
Well, I can't answer the second one, but I can answer the first one. I can be convinced otherwise, but as an outsider to all of this, I would be rather uncomfortable grading students purely on the point score from the simulation. That's not set in stone for me. I could be convinced otherwise, but my instinct says that that's not the way to go.
I'd like to weigh in on both 1 and 2.
Let me just say at least why,
Sure.
and then
Oh,
I'll
I'm
let Rob
sorry.
take it. People are better at using computers than others. And this is a very intimidating thing for some students. This whole experience is an enormously intimidating thing. They end up playing, for every homework, they end up playing 3 or 4 games. Get it done, write it down, move on. I had what did we call our students who played hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of games? We had nicknames for all of these students, but those guys clearly, they were almost born next to a keyboard. They love this stuff, and they destroyed this game. They played every possible strategy, and they were the high point scorers, clearly. I'm not sure that that's true. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's true. But again, I don't know. But I'd be willing I can be convinced either way. But my instinct says that that correlation is not true. I think that there's a very specific tool set around using computers, and that is not a one-to-one correlation with problem solving in other parts of life. That's a good research question. I agree.
I think one point to raise about that is some of the best learning takes place when you try non-optimal strategies. So we don't want to penalize students that deliberately try to bust or fail the system in some way in order to learn about how it works. And so that's a reason not to grade them based on a point system. The points are entirely arbitrary anyway in this sort of relative type model. Sure,
we could do. I also wanted to say that performing well in the simulation is a separate thing from the actually learning in the simulation. And what they were graded on, as Gordon mentioned, was graded in the sense to the extent that they were, was on the richness of the analysis of what happened, what they went through, and that's really what we're aiming for, not whether they could figure out the minimize the negative and maximize the positive and come out with the highest score. Now that may be an issue with the scoring system, but getting to taking that qualitative, natural language analysis of something that happened that really demonstrates an understanding of the synthesis of the disciplines and translating that into a scoring system is a very difficult thing to do.
Yeah, we should. I want to make sure a couple other people can get in, so I'm happy to talk with you after.
Yeah, I'd love
but
to
Frank,
talk
go ahead.
about
Yeah.
this.
I just wanted to reflect and ask a question. It seems to me that anyone who's taking a role within a simulation and does require the merging of different disciplines in their understanding in order to make decisions, that the goal of that kind of simulation, if you grant it, is training in judgment, so that the person develops a kind of informed intuition that may not be easily, as you were describing it, set out in a collection of formulas. They just become more informed practitioners. Now let's say we grant that as a possible result of the work we've done here. It seems to me that the ultimate goal of this is somehow that those two people have the capacity to exercise the same kind of judgment. That it isn't the Columbia College students with their 1,500 college boards and their capacity to develop this synthetic knowledge and this capacity for judgment, but it's going to be ultimately the task and capacity of the task of people like them in some kind of educational context, and that to be able to communicate and develop a cultural context that raises the level of consciousness of Fatu and Kojo to basically perform that way. And I was wondering what kind of thought has gone into the transmission process, from the practitioner of sustainable development to the, in a sense, target populations that are being subjected to these abject conditions.
Yeah, thanks for those thoughts. Actually, I think about it a little bit differently. That the other targets outside of Columbia are actually not our farmers. I do believe that I've met a lot of people in Africa, and I really believe they optimize under the conditions that are given them, and that they actually have very little learning to do. What do I mean by that? I mean that what actually changes the dynamics of the simulation is the government coming in and say, we're going to reduce the cost of your road by 90%. That's what completely explodes, because now the village on taxation can afford the cost of the road, and all of a sudden everything starts changing. That was not an educational issue for that's not something I can go out and teach smallholder farmers. My other audience outside of Columbia is the people who make decisions in terms of international development. That's my other target audience. I don't really have much to teach people who are, I actually believe, optimizing quite well on the ground. They know exactly what they're doing in terms of target number of children. They've got very few inputs for farming. They know they do the best they can. In terms of what little resources they have, I think it's been shown that people do optimize even no matter how poor they are. The people who are not optimizing on a larger picture are the people who make decisions about these societies.
Gordy, let me just push back on you a little bit. I mean, the research done by a colleague of mine here at Columbia in anthropology, for instance, in Kenya, did an analysis that eventually was a dissertation and then published, that the intuitive response of, I think it was the Kikuyu, to urban-rural migration was to accelerate the number of children they had, so that they could both send people to the city and also keep people working on the farms in order to produce the crop and to engage in trade and barter, as well as to bring dollars in. And it really seemed, at least on the basis of that analysis, that was the intuitive response, but it was a wrong response.
I'm not sure that's true.
Well, I'm not sure either.
I think those people could have been economically optimizing for that situation. It's certainly not the socially optimal response. I agree. Society does not want these people to be having 9 children. In the long term, it's detrimental. But in the short term, if you are that family and you've got economic income options from the city, and 30% of your children die before the age of 5, it really might be optimal to have 8 children from an economics point of view. So again, that's not. I think less about that. I think more about the folks in the Ministry of the Interior who are making decisions between building urban infrastructure and a little more rural infrastructure. Maybe those people aren't optimizing because they don't really fundamentally care about the outcomes on the farm here. And that's where the education is.
Thank you.
Okay, so I know there are a lot more questions, and we're happy to hang around after, but we have to get to the closing of the conference. So I want to thank everybody for their attendance. I thank our presenters. And the closing, including those little raffle tickets that you got when you walked in, that little prize opportunity is going to be happening out here in the rotunda in just a few minutes.